Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. Well, Flynn as National Security Advisor, Pompeo at the CIA. Now, Mike Huckabee is going to be the American ambassador to Israel. The names being bandied around as Secretary of State include John Bolton, and these are leaks coming from the Trump camp. Whether or not Bolton actually gets it or not, we'll see, but it's an indication of where their thinking is. Put all this together, and we're getting a much more of a picture of where the real Trump stands on U.S. foreign policy. Of course, I must not forget to mention the most important name in this whole gallery of some people would call rogues, and that's Vice President Pence himself, who is leading the transition team. It looks like, everyone thinks, has extraordinary power. When asked who he wanted to model his vice presidency after, he said Dick Cheney, and there's every reason to think he might have that kind of power. Now joining us to discuss where all this is leading Trump government's foreign policy is Max Blumenthal. Max is an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, is the author of Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. His latest book is The 51-Day War, Ruin and Resistance in Gaza. Thanks for joining us, Max.
Good to be with you.
So this all leads to, one thinks, picking up where Bush-Cheney left off. Cheney's hope was to bomb Iran. He and circles around him advocated it most directly. He was pretty closely connected with Netanyahu, who wanted to do the same thing. For a lot of reasons. They claim it's about the nuclear program, but I think most people look at the situation. It has a lot to do with regional power, with the destruction of Iraq. Iran's hand has been strengthened. They certainly want to undercut Hezbollah. So give us a sense of what this team has said and what's likely will be their plans based on what we know of their history.
Well, if you follow any neocon on Twitter today or read any statement from the kind of neoconservative think tank world in Washington, which really was anticipating a Hillary Clinton victory and wanted a Hillary Clinton victory because of statements Trump had made, I think you're seeing them breathe a big sigh of relief. One reason is Mike Pompeo, at CIA director. Mike Pompeo, the congressman from Kansas, who's basically owned by the Koch brothers, but who has also been a fanatical militarist who is obsessed with bringing Snowden back for prosecution, has even singled out Glenn Greenwald. And of course, today tweeted, as he was announced as CIA director, that he was determined to unravel the Iran deal. Michael Flynn is going to be national security advisor to Trump, mainly because he probably wouldn't have made it through any confirmation hearing. He sees Iran as an Islamic republic, like any other country that's majority Muslim that kind of openly identifies as a Muslim country. I mean, he sees it in the same way that he sees Afghanistan or Pakistan or Saudi Arabia. He basically sees Islam as the greatest threat to Western civilization. And so Flynn conflates Iran with countries that actually see it as an adversary and has a very crude view of geopolitics. At the same time, Flynn is accused of wanting to accommodate with Russia, which would make it pretty difficult if he wanted to do that to tear up the Iran deal. And you have Trump, who said the same thing, that he wants to ally with Russia to smash not only ISIS, but Al-Qaeda, which has the largest franchise in its history right now in Syria. And Russia's, of course, directly engaged in the Syrian war theater. So you have all these warring factions. And you also, if you look at the Iran deal, so far it's been pretty successful in accomplishing the goal of nuclear non-proliferation. Iran is not moving towards a nuclear weapons program. And that fact, has to be considered by people who were calling for the deal to be torn up in 2015. And so it's unclear what will happen with the Iran deal right now. It is clear that you have a bunch of figures who are more reflective of the Bush-Cheney approach to foreign policy, especially the Cheney approach, which by extension is the Pence approach, than the Trump approach. And Trump will either completely capitulate to them, or you're going to see, and I think the latter version is more likely, a kind of political reenactment of The Sopranos within the White House.
Well, the one thing they all have in common, even though there has been some disagreement, for example, between Pence and Trump on just whether to be aggressive towards Russia or not, all of them agree on regime change in Iran. And you can imagine a coming together on this issue, which if the great negotiator Trump, and I would suspect this is what's in his head, and this would also jive with Flynn, if they can make a deal with Russia to back off and allow them to get rid of Assad in Syria, perhaps give the Russians, keep your base, we'll make sure the jihadists don't take over. You can get the Iraqi state and army, but without Assad. There's deals to be made here if you sit there and play the negotiator role. In other words, there's deals to say also, we're going to rip up the agreement with Iran. What do you want? Flynn's very much for ripping up the deal with Iran, even though he has this conciliatory position towards Russia. I assume he got paid to be on RT, the Russia Today network, and because of that, he went to some celebration for the RT network. But other than that, he seems to be pretty much on the same page as the rest of this worldview, which is really target Iran, and the rest you can worry about. You make work to achieve your prime objective.
Yeah, I don't really see any of that happening. It's entirely possible because some of these figures, especially Flynn, see geopolitics in an irrational, almost theological sense, a lot like General Jerry Boykin. And Flynn, when he was at the, the Department of at the Defense Intelligence Agency, the people in the Pentagon had this term Flynn facts, because Flynn would kind of come in with his own facts irrespective of the intelligence that was provided to him. So there's definitely a strange Lovian capacity among these figures, but I don't see them making a deal to remove Assad, because the assessment on Syria will be made in February 2017, and by then I can see the rebels being completely rolled back, the insurgency against the Syrian government being completely quelled, and there really being no more pressure for the removal of Assad, only these kind of crushing, intensifying sanctions like the recent bill that was pushed through the House of Representatives.
The Assad, I'm speculating what a possible deal with Russia could be, but
Russia and Assad are on the same.
Do you not think these guys are very focused on?
Russia will not allow anything to happen to Assad at any point, especially now. Syria is the only Russian client state in the Arab League, and they're absolutely on the same page with Assad and the Syrian military.
But do you think they're going to take that kind of position on Iran? They certainly didn't when it came to very harsh sanctions.
There's going to be pressure on the Trump administration from the neoconservative and hawkish Republican elements to do just that. And I think the alternative is to empower the more radical elements, the IRGC, the Iranian Republican Guard Council, which sort of represents those elements, the kind of forces that gravitated around Ahmadinejad. These are the forces that will come back to power and enjoy the tearing up of the Iran deal. They're the ones that opposed the Iran deal. And so, Trump has to, Trump and all of these figures have to make an assessment. We're against radical Islam. That's what they say. So do we embolden it by tearing up this deal and capitulating to capitulating to domestic pressure? And how do they do that when they're coordinating with Russia in Syria? How do you do that when you're coordinating with the Iraqi government, and the Iraqi security forces, which are majority Shia, which are at the spearhead of the campaign against ISIS in Mosul? How do you do that when you're coordinating with various forces to extricate ISIS from Raqqa? It doesn't make sense.
But it didn't make sense to invade Iraq. You can have all the same logic about how crazy it was to invade Iraq, and in fact, all the professionals were against the invasion of Iraq. They gave all the arguments geopolitically, what would happen in terms of in strengthening Iran's position in the region. They gave all the arguments how it's going to be utter chaos. You're not going to be able to control the outcome of what happens after this fall of Saddam. All the heads of agencies, the intelligence, military, the preponderance of the professionals were telling Cheney not to do this. And he told, we know from various sources that he essentially said either you're on board or you're fired, you can resign.
Well, I think we need to go back to the Republican primary. One of the most memorable moments, probably one of my favorite moments in political history, was that I was conscious of, was Trump humiliating Jeb Bush, not only about the war in Iraq, but about 9/11 and the entire war on terror. What a colossal failure it was. And this was a signal moment. This is when Trump channeled the mood, not only of mainstream Americans who are sick of these costly interventions, but of the Republican base, which seemed to be sick of them as well. And it worked for him. And it was the only time we've seen the Bushes held accountable. So Trump also has to contend with American popular opinion, which is hostile now to expansionism and isolationism. And he really represents the new face of the Republican base, which is very much like the face of the French right wing, of Marine Le Pen, the face of the British right, which supported Brexit. It's protectionist and isolationist. And he has all these figures coming in who reflect Cheney-esque policy.
I was about to say, not a single appointment that agrees with him on this stuff.
Right. So
starting with the most important appointment, which was Pence.
The reason that Bush got his domestic agenda through, not only the invasion of Iraq, but his domestic agenda, was because 9/11 it electrified everything. I mean, Bush had 90% approval rating after 9/11, and that lasted, and that also influenced the way that the press covered Bush. They were afraid to take him on. Trump has no such protection. And he's under enormous pressure from the Republican base to go in a more realist direction. So I think what we're looking at is a very weak administration, massive internecine warfare within the administration, locked infighting, and it's really unclear to me which direction they'll go. But one thing is clear, is that all of these figures, all of them, including Trump, are expressing a view of Islam and Muslims that is nothing short of incitement to violence, and they've emboldened elements in this country to lash out in a vigilante fashion. And so that's the immediate effect that I can see of these appointments.
Yeah, I agree with you certainly on that point. I don't see them on very different pages when it comes to Iran, and unless they go against all their rhetoric that's
it would mean going against
for years,
Russia,
I don't see
and tearing up everything Trump said.
Say what?
It would,
No, the one thing he's been consistent about is he wants to tear up the Iran agreement. He's never said otherwise. This is the one. Pence and Trump differ on the question of the approach to Russia, at least at the level of rhetoric. Maybe Pence and Flynn even disagree on the issue of Russia on the level of rhetoric, but they have all been consistent on the issue of Iran.
Right. I mean, Pence and Trump clashed over a no-fly zone in Syria, but it would be impossible to implement such a thing without essentially going to war with Russia. So I think...
Well, that's an assumption, and we'll see. As I say, Russia did not oppose in any serious way these sanctions that were exerted, that were almost a form of, or not almost, were a form of economic warfare on Iran and the Iranian people. When it came to Gaddafi, yes, they initially were opposed to the violation of the UN resolution with the extension of the war and the attempts to overthrow Gaddafi. But when push came to shove, and it seems that when they were offered their oil concession that they were negotiating through the Italian oil company in Libya, Medvedev came and completely reversed the position and said it was time for Gaddafi to go.
That's because Medvedev was there. Medvedev was an extremely weak figure. There was no Security Council veto of the intervention in Libya because of Medvedev. And Putin has said that if he was there, he would have done it. It was part of his motivation for removing Medvedev, and it's what motivates him in Syria. The jihadist insurgency, and in Libya, I guess you couldn't call it an insurgency, essentially a takeover, is what brought Putin to take such a strong position.
Do you think Putin will get into a direct confrontation with the United States over Iran?
I never said that, but I think that if the United States attempts to implement a no-fly zone in Syria, it'll have to contend with S-300 and 400 Russian batteries as well.
I'm not talking about Syria.
It's not going to happen. But if you look at who the alliance is in Syria in support of the Syrian government, who's exactly on the same page and stands to gain from the rollback of the insurgency, which is really inevitable at this point, it's Iran and Russia and all the the Shiite militias that are allied with them. So Iran and Russia are essentially on the same page. And for Russia to allow any threat to the Iran deal would mean it would threaten its intentions in Syria. So I think.
And how can they stop it? I mean, this is a gang, a Cheney-esque gang that cares nothing for international law, nothing for the United Nations. What exactly can Russia do to stop this if in fact this group wants to carry out what they have been more or less saying for the last few years?
If this group wants to act unilaterally, tear up the Iran deal.
I think they would have to act unilaterally to do it. The other Europe won't sign off on ripping it up. Never mind Russia.
Which is entirely possible. It would mean not only reneging on everything Trump said about Russia, but also compromising the campaign against ISIS in Iraq and Syria and emboldening radical elements in Iran, which have been sidelined because of this deal. That's the consequence. And I can't really engage in predicting the future.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you at all on the outcome. I just remind myself that I said all the same things before the Iraq war, saying there's just no way they can do this because there was a whole list of reasons why it was bad in American interest, bad for American interest.
I think, Paul, though, you're right that we're witnessing sort of a massive shift, at least a momentary shift in the Washington consensus. And that also applies to Israel-Palestine. The signal that Trump has sent there is appointing Mike Huckabee, former Arkansas governor and avowed Christian Zionist, apocalyptic Christian Zionist, as ambassador to Israel. Mike Huckabee is someone who's denied that Palestinians exist. He's not only a supporter of the settlement enterprise, he's someone who goes to the settlements and enjoys a close relationship with the Yesha Council, the main governing council of the illegal settlement enterprise in the West Bank. I mean, he's close to the leadership of the far-right Jewish Home Party, which favors a single apartheid state. And this is someone who's going to advocate for those policies. This is the signal that the Trump administration is sending Israel. And, they've removed the kind of veneer of the Oslo era peace process and the two-state solution. The United States government is no longer going to pretend to support a two-state solution. It's allowing Israel to become what it's wanted to be, which is a binational apartheid state that formalizes official discrimination against Palestinians and incorporates the settlements as part of Israel. So that's a massive shift in the Washington consensus. And to some extent, it means that this administration will love Israel to death.
Yeah. Well, to be continued. I hope in your analysis of the possibility and that this government and Congress are at each other's throats and won't agree on this kind of aggressive Iran strategy in the final analysis. I hope you're right and I'm wrong.
Well,
thanks for joining us, Max.
The only thing I can say now is that the only thing they're united by is Islamophobia, which is already having some troubling domestic effects. And it's of a part with the appointment of Jeff Sessions, someone who said his only problem with the Ku Klux Klan, or is said to have said his only problem with the Ku Klux Klan, is that they smoke marijuana.
Thanks for joining us, Max.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.
Washington, which really was anticipating a Hillary Clinton victory and wanted a Hillary Clinton victory because of statements Trump had made. I think you're seeing them breathe a big sigh of relief. One reason is Mike Pompeo, at CIA director. Mike Pompeo, the congressman from Kansas, who's basically owned by the Koch brothers, but who has also been a fanatical militarist who is obsessed with bringing Snowden back for prosecution, has even singled out Glenn Greenwald. And of course, today,
Much more of a picture of where the real Trump stands on U.S. foreign policy. Of course, I must not forget to mention the most important name in this whole gallery of some people would call rogues, and that's Vice President Pence himself, who is leading the transition team. It looks like, everyone thinks, has extraordinary power. When asked who he wanted to model his vice presidency after, he said Dick Cheney. And there's every reason to think he might have that kind of power. Now joining us to discuss where all this is leading Trump government's foreign policy is Max Blumenthal. Max is an award-winning journalist, best-selling author, is the author of Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel. His latest book is The 51-Day War, Ruin and Resistance in Gaza. Thanks for joining us, Max.
good to be with you.
So this all leads to, one thinks, picking up where Bush-Cheney left off. Cheney's hope was to bomb Iran. He and circles around him advocated it most directly. He was pretty closely connected with Netanyahu, who wanted to do the same thing. Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay. Well, Flynn as National Security Advisor, Pompeo at the CIA. Now, Mike Huckabee is going to be the American ambassador to Israel. The names being bandied around as Secretary of State include John Bolton, and these are leaks coming from the Trump camp. Whether or not Bolton actually gets it or not, we'll see, but it's an indication of where their thinking is. Put all this together, and we're getting for a lot of reasons. They claim it's about the nuclear program, but I think most people look at the situation. It has a lot to do with regional power, with the destruction of Iraq. Iran's hand has been strengthened. They certainly want to undercut Hezbollah. So give us a sense of what this team has said and what's likely will be their plans based on what we know of their history.
Well, if you follow any neocon on Twitter today or read any statement from the kind of neoconservative think tank world in Washington,